if social justice issues were easy to resolve, we would have figured it out long ago.
Totally.
So the fact that we haven't figured out, they're incredibly complex problems that intersect with one another, that, reflect centuries of history and culture and norms, and there is so much that we are working against and working toward. And so yes, we need everybody of all abilities, all temperaments, to bring what they can.
Welcome to season 13 of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. I want to thank you for watching, enjoy the show, and if you haven't already picked up a copy, I invite you to do so. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today, I am joined by Dorcas Cheng-Tozun, who is an award-winning writer, editor, speaker, communications consultant, and former Inc.com columnist. She is the author of 3 books: Start, Love, Repeat, How to Stay in Love with Your Entrepreneur in a Crazy Startup World. It sounds amazing. Second book is Let There Delight, how one social enterprise brought solar products to 100 million people. And this fantastic book, Social Justice for the Sensitive Soul, How to Change the World in Quiet Ways. Her work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Christianity Today, Image Journal, and a dozen other publications in the US, in Asia, and in Africa. She serves as the editorial director of PAX, a Christian nonprofit dedicated to inspiring and equipping the next generation of BIPOC contemplative activists, and teaches social innovation at Valley Christian Schools. We have a lot in common, actually. Welcome to the show, Dorcas.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here.
Same. And you know how you came onto my radar? I love it. We both have the same publisher, Broadleaf
Right.
Books. And I think we were just saying on the pre-call that we both loved working with them.
It's a great experience. Wonderful people.
And I was invited to do a blurb of your book.
Yes.
So
yes. Well, I think I found your book through Broadleaf and was like, I need to speak to this woman because we are very much, thinking along the same lines. And so thank you for being willing to write a blurb for me.
Well, it was my honor. This is such an important book. And I'm just going to read for anybody listening or reading. You got to just immediately click onto Amazon or your favorite online, or go to your favorite independent bookstore, whatever. But put this at the top of your list. Here's what I wrote. Cheng-Tozun offers a brilliant thesis and a timely message penned with the authenticity of lived experience. Part love letter and part manifesto, this book is a must-read for any and all empath changemakers who are called to social change work, but shun the limelight of activism or heropreneurship of social innovation.
Yeah, I love that. So good.
So, okay, this is about you now. What do you think are the particular challenges that empaths, and while you answer the question, tell us what you think an empath is. What are the particular challenges that they face as they engage in the good fight of social justice work?
Yeah, so I talk about sensitive souls, right? That's in the title. And there's 3 categories of people that I'm primarily thinking about. So empaths is certainly one of them. Highly sensitive people is another. And then the third are just people who are highly introverted. So there's a lot of introverts in the world, but those of us who are highly introverted, right? There's a lot of overlap across those 3 categories in terms of characteristics and challenges and gifts that we have. But some people may only identify as 1, some may identify as 2 or 3. I have a little bit of all 3 of them in me. And I think empaths in particular are those who have this ability, this particular ability to really connect with other people, with the planet, with nature, with animals. They just have this sort of extra sensitive sense to what is the vibe, what are people feeling, what is the emotion, how are others doing, and they intuit that just by being in the presence of other people and other beings. And so it's an incredible gift to be an empath and to bring that sense of, I deeply understand you, just intuitively, because I have the opportunity to interact with you. But then when you go into justice spaces where there is a lot of hardship, there is suffering, there's oppression, there's trauma, as an empath, it is really easy to absorb that and to take that on, right? So if you are around a lot of people who are suffering, who are angry, who are really upset, that is going to start to feel like your experience as well. And as somebody who feels a lot of those emotions, I know that it gets to the point where it feels like you are almost carrying the burden of the world on your shoulders, right? Because it's not only your own trauma and emotions that you are carrying, but now you've absorbed it from so many other people, and it can just feel like too much. And it can be very, very overwhelming. And as you know, I'm sure you know, and many of your listeners know, secondary trauma is a very, very real thing. And I think for empaths in particular, we are at greater risk for that, just because our ability to kind of take that on is stronger than your typical person.
Yeah. Now, when I was writing the book, like I love quotes. There's a special name for somebody who loves quotes. It's a quotophile or something like that. Anyway, and I came across a whole whack of new like writers' quotes, and one of them was, "You write the book you need to read." And
Mhm.
I would like to know if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about yourself and your story that would help contextualize why you wrote the book.
Yes. So this book basically answers a fundamental question that I have been wrestling with on like a soul level for a good 20 years. But it took me this long to be able to articulate what the question and the struggle actually was. So when I was in college, I just developed a real passion for social justice and knew that that was where I wanted to go with my career. And so after graduating, I went into the nonprofit sector and have been in and out of the nonprofit sector, the social enterprise space, for a number of years now. And I loved the work, and yet I kept burning out over and over again. And I was on pretty much a regular 2 year cycle of I'd go into a job, lots of excitement, lots of energy, loved the people I was working with, loved what I was doing. And then at the end of the 2 years, just totally exhausted. And then I would take a break and I'd start all over again. And and I think what was really discouraging was that I had this assumption that my sort of ability to manage the stress would just grow stronger over time. And actually, my burnouts became worse. So every time I burned out, it just got worse and worse and worse, to the point where I think the very worst one was when I was living and working in mainland China. We had moved there in 2008 for my husband's social enterprise, which is Delight, the one that I wrote the book about. So they provide solar powered products for families all around the world who don't have access to electricity. So we were in China doing the manufacturing, the engineering, the logistics, the distribution. I don't specialize in any of those things, but I was there helping in any capacity that I could, aside from that. But it was an extraordinarily challenging experience, doing a startup, doing a multinational startup, working in a foreign country. I'm Chinese American, but as my relatives will tell you, there is very little Chinese in me. So it was very much a foreign country for me. And it was brutal. And so after about a year of being there, I became so depressed and so anxious, because it felt like a very hostile environment for me as a Chinese American, as somebody who is obviously Chinese. There were particular cultural expectations placed on me by the Chinese nationals, which, I certainly understand to some degree. But when I couldn't meet those expectations, there was a lot of anger directed at me. And it was just day in, day out, just strangers on the street constantly yelling at me for not being able to communicate well enough or understand the cultural norms or know even how to do basic things, because I had never lived there before. And so it broke me down, and I got to the point where I didn't even want to leave the apartment that we were living in. And it was a good probably year and a half a very severe depression, anxiety, really couldn't do it, couldn't work, could do very little except sleep, cry, talk to a couple, good friends and a spiritual director who kind of started to help pull me out of that. But that was a very, very dark season in my life. And even when I was able to move beyond that, it still has stayed with me. I still have chronic anxiety. I feel like, depression is one of those things that it just kind of follows you the rest of your life. Once you've known it, it becomes your friend, whether you want it to be or not, and it continues to follow you. And so I have been very conscientious of whatever activism I engage in, whatever job I take on, whatever volunteerism I do. I have very real limitations because I tried to push those limitations for a very long time and faced severe consequences for pushing myself too hard. And so then, I mean, where this book specifically came from is in the summer of 2020 is actually when Broadly first approached me, and they very generously asked me, if you were to write another book, what would it be about? And at the time I said, I don't know, but let me think about it. And I went on a walk. And if you'll recall, summer of 2020, this is right at the beginning of the pandemic. So going out on a walk was pretty much the only activity I could do. I have two young children. So the rest of the time I was stuck at home with them. They were not able to go to school. I live in California in the Bay Area. So we were very locked down, right? Nobody was going to school. Nobody was commuting to work. Although we were all still trying to work and take care of our kids full time with no help. It was really challenging. So there was the pandemic. There were all of the social inequities that were being revealed because of the pandemic. Certainly here in the US and maybe to some degree in other places, there was a lot of anti-Asian hate and violence and discrimination that was emerging because of COVID having come from China. So all over the news, there were acts of violence being committed against particularly elderly Asians and Asian Americans, which was particularly alarming. And a lot of those acts of violence were happening here in the Bay Area where I live. And so it was a really scary time to be Asian and certainly to have older relatives who are Asian as well. We were very, very concerned for the safety of our parents and our aunts and uncles and grandparents. And then, of course, on top of all that, you had George Floyd's murder in May, the Black Lives Matter protests, right? So there was so much going on in the summer of 2020, and it felt like the world was falling apart. And I felt that burden so much in my body and in my spirit, and I wanted to engage, I wanted to help, and there was a part of me that was so scared because I thought, well, what happens if I step back into the fray? So since having kids, I've worked more part-time and haven't gone kind of at the full throttle that I was going before I had kids. But this really felt like it was pulling me back into a lot of social issues that I cared deeply about. But I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know how to do it in a way that felt sustainable, that felt true to who I was, where I felt like the good I could do would outweigh the harm that I would experience. And so then as I was taking that walk and thinking about book options and what was going on in the world, the title of the book just sort of popped into my head, fully formed, of Social Justice for the Sensitive Soul. And I realized this is exactly what I have been wrestling with for more than 20 years, is that I am a really sensitive person operating in challenging spaces, and I have been trying to be like everyone else and pretend that I don't have these sensitivities and pretend that the pain that I have encountered doesn't affect me as much as it does. And so as I was thinking about this, I realized, well, certainly I'm not the only one. I can't be the only one who wrestles with this. And so very much to the quote that you said earlier, I wanted to answer this question for myself. because it felt so fundamental to who I am and the work that I feel called to do. And I hoped that it could be of some help to others who are like me.
So what have you been hearing from people who read it, who have a sensitive soul like you and can really recognize themselves in your pages?
Yeah, it's been really beautiful. I've heard from readers who feel like they're seen for the first time, who feel like they're really understood. I talked to this woman who she's probably in her 70s, and she told me that my book helped her understand her entire life. Like she was, now after all these years, she's going back and kind of reviewing the entirety of her life through this lens of, yes, I am a sensitive person who loves justice. And it explains everything that I have done and how I've reacted and how I've responded to things. And that was just incredible to hear, and so it feels incredibly meaningful to be able to give voice to people like me who want to do so much good, who are capable of doing so much good. And yet, we need to do it in our own way. We can't be necessarily the activists shouting and chanting in the streets. We're gonna find our own very meaningful paths to advocate for what is fair and equitable in our communities.
Right. And it's not fair for the people who are the loud activists with the bullhorns to throw shade because you're quieter. You know what I mean? Like everybody's needed. It's an all hands on deck moment, right?
Absolutely. I feel that so strongly, right? I mean, if if social justice issues were easy to resolve, we would have figured it out long ago.
Totally.
So the fact that we haven't figured out, they're incredibly complex problems that intersect with one another, that, reflect centuries of history and culture and norms, and there is so much that we are working against and working toward. And so yes, we need everybody of all abilities, all temperaments, to bring what they can to the table. And I think, your point about activists throwing shade, unfortunately, that is a reality. I there one of the really fascinating things I found in my research for this book is how there is a particular activist culture that social scientists are really starting to look at now and document. And part of that activist culture is this pressure, this unrelenting, almost inhumane pressure of, you have to be committed to the cause, mind, body, soul, spirit. And if you are not 1,000% committed, then you don't count at all. Like it needs to be 24/7. You can't think about your family, you can't think about your own health, you can't think about sleeping, or god forbid, having fun. Like you need to be completely dedicated to the cause. And if you don't meet those unrealistic expectations of commitment, then it's like, you don't matter at all, that your participation, what you can give, that it's like it's dismissed. And I really feel like that that's a really heartbreaking reality, because the work of justice is so much about caring for people. And so we need to remember to care for one another as well, and to care for ourselves, and that is actually a very integral part of what it means to be somebody um who who wants to work for the social good. Is we are all part of it, and so we all matter. And it very much, to me, makes sense that we would practice that care for those that we're serving, for those we're advocating for those we're allied with, as well as for our peers and for ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned something a minute ago where you were talking about the research that you did for the book, and I would love to know if there's any bit of research you came across that surprised you that you would want to share as like a little hook, like read more about this in my book? What caught your attention when you were doing the research?
Yeah, I think one of the statistics that I most appreciated and was not expecting when I was researching was from a paper published by Adam Grant, the organizational psychologist, and he did a review of over 500 studies. And in all of these studies, it involved two people of differing backgrounds. So, different nationality, ethnicity, socioeconomic background, religion, two people of different backgrounds sitting down together, didn't know each other, right? They're sitting down face to face. This is not over Zoom. This is not a phone call. They're sitting down face to face and they're just having a conversation. And I think a lot of times especially now, and I would say particularly now in the US, when you think about sitting down with somebody who is different from you and who probably has a very, very different perspective on life from you, there is very much this sense of like, oh, I need to convince them. I need to get them on my side. I need to make sure they see things how I see things. But in these studies, it was just about having a conversation. It was just about getting to know one another. There was no agenda. There was no, debate or somebody trying to win an argument. And in those conversations across all of these studies, there was a 94% of the time, it led to a reduction in prejudice and bias. And so it really hit home to me the fact that how simple is it for any of us? I mean, it can feel risky, it certainly, and I almost feel like we've gotten out of the practice of it, and certainly post-COVID we have. But that's something that any of us could do, is just to sit down with someone and just be kind, and just listen and ask questions and try to get to know them. And that is actually a far higher success rate than almost any other sort of activist action that I came across, right? And not that those other forms of action don't matter. I think they can be very effective in their own way, but to recognize that the ability to strengthen our communities, to reach out to people, to grow trust among people of different backgrounds, that is not as hard as we might think. And it's something that we can all participate in, even if you are highly sensitive, highly empathic, or highly introverted.
What comes to mind is like, I wonder how much we could save on our public security and police and military budgets if we just all spent the money on like gift certificates to coffee shops where people can meet and chat. You know what I mean?
Wouldn't that be beautiful? I love that.
Wouldn't it be? Hi there. At the risk of interrupting this great conversation, I just want to draw your attention to two things. There's over 150 episodes on the Purposeful Empathy channel. You may want to check them out. And I would invite you to press the subscribe button so that you get them into your mailbox every week so you don't miss a show. Thanks so much for watching. Without any ad spend or SEO, we have over 25,000 organic views. I want to thank you so much for watching. Again, hit the subscribe button. The world needs more empathy and you have a role to play. All right, I had another question for you that's more specific to empathy. And that is like, what do you think the role of empathy is within activism and activist circles?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think there's a couple of things. So I might even look at it from two different angles. So in terms of actually, I'm going to say three different areas. So to the point that I was saying earlier about how unrealistic activism culture is nowadays, if empaths can step into that space and just acknowledge the burden that we are all carrying, the weights that we are carrying, and the need to acknowledge our own humanity and our own limitations, and to see that in fellow activists, and to be able to speak to that and to acknowledge, we're all doing good work, but we're not robots. We're not machines. We need to rest. We need balance in our lives. And our best activist self comes from a place of health and groundedness. If we don't take the time to be, rooted in who we are, in the people we love, in spirituality, it's going to be really hard for us to kind of stay pointed to that North Star of why are we doing this. You can get caught up in the work itself, or in the specifics of how you think it should be done, or strategy, or how people need to be acting, but ultimately it's about people. And so I think for the empathic activists to be able to advocate on behalf of other activists is really powerful and meaningful. And I think we desperately, desperately need that nowadays in activist circles. I'll say also that empaths, in the work, in their ability to stay connected to people and people's stories and their experiences, that is what is going to move us toward solutions that actually work, solutions that actually meet the real felt needs of real people. In one of the chapters of my book, I talk about engineers and innovators and inventors and product designers as people who can very much work for justice. And I think empathy is like the magic ingredient, that if you throw that in with somebody who is really inventive, then their ability to create something that exactly meets people where they are and can transform their lives in a really positive way, it's incredible, the possibilities. And I think engineering without empathy is fine. It creates some cool stuff in the world, but to really address these seemingly intractable issues of global poverty and climate change, I mean, you need really technologically savvy and empathic people who can understand this is what people are truly experiencing, what they actually need, and this is the kind of technology that may be able to meet their needs. And then I would say the third area is that in activism, it is very easy to get caught up in the anger, the hostility. It's a very, very frustrating. It can be very frustrating, right? To feel like there are certain people and systems and organizations that you're coming up against. And while I think anger is a powerful emotion and it can certainly push us toward action in a good way, I don't believe that anger can sustain us in the long run, right? And it ends up causing us more harm than good. I see anger as a very blunt instrument, right? Where you may end up hurting a lot of people that you didn't intend to hurt if you're just operating out of a place of anger. And so if there are individuals who are in activist spaces, but they're able to cultivate empathy even for people who don't agree with them, even for people who oppose them, I think that is a far more powerful and effective approach. I mean, it's very much how Gandhi, Martin Luther King, right? All of these incredible justice leaders that we admire, their most profound contribution, I think, to the work of social justice was this ability to see their, quote unquote enemy as a human being, as a potential friend. And that is Martin Luther King's vision of the beloved community, which is that, it's not just about getting the legislation passed or the court decision that you want. If you get that, but you alienate all these people along the way, and you push a bunch of people away from your cause, that is not ultimately the victory that you want. You want the victory where there is change for good, and you are bringing more and more people into the fold. You are bringing in and connecting with even the people who don't agree with you, so that you can see one another in your common humanity, and be able to work together toward what is good for all of us.
Yeah. Yeah. With that kind of conjures up for me as if we're busy canceling people on our side or off our side. We have less
Right.
people to collaborate with, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, very much so. Yeah.
So I have a couple of other questions before I ask my final question that I ask all my guests. And I want to ask you what kind of roles you think empaths, might want to consider if they are pursuing a path of social justice and they want to do it sustainably. Like, what works for them? What would you recommend as roles and activities? And then as a complementary question, what are ways in which sensitive souls and empaths can actually take care of themselves in the good fight?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think, of course, the answer is going to differ based on everyone, right? I believe really strongly in kind of finding that perfect sweet spot where it's what you're good at, where your gifts and talents and skills are, what you're really passionate about, what you care about deeply, as well as what gives you joy. I really would love to see activists be able to find joy in their work, and that
Laugh.
yeah, yeah, and it's not always easy, of course, because of the kinds of issues that we're dealing with. But I do think that joy is part of what will sustain us. And so, is it something that you genuinely love to do and that feels immensely satisfying to you? I think the other key thing for empaths to really think about is, what is the amount of exposure that you feel like you can tolerate to injustice, to oppression, to suffering, to trauma, right? So there's kind of more frontline work, humanitarian aid workers, social workers, right? Those sorts of things, where you will get a lot of exposure, and that may be too hard. And so, are there roles that could be a little bit more behind the scenes, like not quite so close to the front lines, where you still feel like you can do something really meaningful? And I will say there are plenty of roles. It's sort of just finding what works for you. So in the book, I talk about academics and the very important role that research plays in helping us to understand what are the social challenges that we face, what are the root causes of those challenges, and what are possible solutions. I mentioned the engineers and the inventors. There are certainly very important roles for people to serve as teachers, as guides, as mentors, right? So one of my favorite stories that I came across researching the civil rights movement for this book was how there was a school called the Highlander Folk School, where so many of the civil rights activists that we hear about, including Dr. King, including Rosa Parks, and many others, they went through this training program to learn how to engage in nonviolent protest. Excuse me. And so, they wouldn't necessarily have been able to be as effective without that support from the teachers and the mentors that they worked with at this school. And that is invaluable. So you don't necessarily have to be the one marching in the street to have a direct impact on the people who are doing that, or a direct impact on the cause itself. There is a significant role that artists can play, writers, painters, screenwriters, playwrights, all sorts of artists can. I think art speaks to the soul in a way that almost bypasses the brain, and sometimes that's a good thing, right? Because we're so in our heads and we're so trying to rationalize our arguments. But if we can just kind of connect with people through art and again, bringing it down to that level of commonality and humanity, that can speak very powerfully to, you know, what it is that we are advocating for and what the kind of world that we hope to see. So there are many, many opportunities for empaths. I would love to see more empaths, you know, step into the fight, as you say. I also want to, you know, just give the caveat that it's okay to just try something out, you know, check out an organization, volunteer for a couple of hours, see how it feels, because we don't necessarily know right off the bat exactly what role is going to best fit us. And so feel free to explore and experiment and to say no, because that's very much part of the process. I think it's a very healthy process. It's something we all need to go through.
I
To
totally agree, because what comes up for me is the trip that I took in 2008 to Rwanda. My sister and I had done some fundraising. We go there. We were helping a women's collective launch a microfinance project, and it was
yeah.
an incredible summer. And by the end of it, I was exposed to a lot of survivor stories, and I saw,
Mhm.
you know, and I'd traveled quite a bit, but this was a different degree of poverty and suffering. And 2 days before I left, I had a complete existential meltdown where I was like, oh, I don't have I don't have the resilience, the inner fortitude to do frontline humanitarian work. And I was
Mhm.
devastated because I thought that was my entry point. I thought, like, that's it. I found it. And then I realized that
Mhm.
wasn't for me. And, you know, there's this expression, like, if you can't do work, go teach or something. I don't know, some stupid thing like that. But I actually realized that teaching is my contribution,
Mhm.
because if I
Yeah.
can inspire some young people to pursue paths that are not in the consulting or accounting or finance
Yes.
world, and redirect them to social innovation or impact investing or,
Mhm.
you know, like, that's my contribution. And I think
Yes.
what you say is very, very valid.
Very much so. And working toward social progress, this spans generations,
Yeah.
right? It's not just you and me and our generation, we're going to figure it out. That's not the case. And so investing in the next generation is invaluable work. It's
Yeah.
incredibly important.
Yeah.
And with the tools, you know, so I just started teaching a high school class, and the just, you know, this digital generation and how comfortable they are with technology. I mean, they're just going to see the world in a way that's very different from how generations before have seen them, and they are going to come up with ideas that we may not be able to. And so to be able to direct a lot of that intellect and creative energy toward working for the social good, I think you can't even put a value on that, because it makes all the difference
Mhm.
for this planet.
Now, you don't want to skip over the question about how empaths can be
Yeah.
can give themselves self-empathy and self-compassion. So
Yes.
what are, let's say, your top two
Mm,
ways of being kind to yourself as an
yeah.
empath? Mm.
Yeah. Oh gosh, hard to pick top two, because I almost feel like it's to some extent it's kind of a perspective you have, right? A recognition that, well, for one thing, that self-compassion is very important, that it doesn't take away from your work in activism. It actually adds to it. So I believe it's Kristen Neff who has done great research on how the more compassion we are able to show ourselves, the more capacity for compassion we have for others. So it has this wonderful multiplicative effect. And empathy is the same. If you have empathy for yourself, you will have more empathy for others. So I think it actually grows us in our ability, in our capacity, in our strength to be able to engage more with the causes that we care about. So that, I feel like, first step, like, at least accept that, understand that, embrace that this is so important. And it's good for you, it's good for the ones you love, and it's good for the broader world. And then, you know, certainly to listen to your body, pay attention. Empaths and highly sensitive people tend to we experience a lot in our bodies. So once you start paying attention, you'll notice, oh, I have these aches and pains, or I have this tightness, I have this, right? Like for me, even reading certain news articles about stuff that's going on in the world, I will feel physically sick sometimes after reading a news article, right? Because of how much human suffering there is. And I just need to be aware that it's good for me to know what's going on in the world. And yet I don't think I need to know every single excruciating detail of every suffering that every person has experienced. I actually don't believe that we as humans kind of were made with the capacity to handle that much, right? So I have given myself the grace to, like, yes, I will scan the headlines. I will, learn about things, try to know what's going on, try to be well informed. And I'm also going to limit my news consumption. I'm going to limit my time on social media. The things that are not absolutely necessary, right? And that can really kind of tear me down. I'm going to try to limit my exposure to those things and save that energy for the interactions and actions that really matter. And then I would say to definitely find something that fills you, something that restores you. I love to sleep, so it could certainly be sleep. And if not sleep, it could be art, it could be reading, it could be nature, right? Exercise. Those are all beautiful expressions of who we are in our humanity and in who we are as individuals. And I think the more we grow in our appreciation for the world around us and everything that the world has to offer us, the more kind of beautiful and whole our offering will be when we engage in the spaces of justice, because we can bring this deep love for our communities and fellow human beings and our planet.
Wow, that was poetic. And I love the words, give ourselves the grace. I'm going to remember that. Dorcas,
Yeah.
I have one more question.
Yes.
It's a lovely conversation. Again, folks, if you're enjoying this conversation as much as I am, you've got to pick up this book, Social Justice for the Sensitive Soul, How to Change the World in Quiet Ways. So my question is, can you think of a time in your life when you were on the receiving end of empathy and what that meant for you?
Oh, yes. I'll since I already mentioned my time in China. So, this was 2008, 2009. Zoom didn't exist then, so there was only Skype back then. And I had a friend here in the US who, when things got really hard for me, she committed to do a weekly Skype call with me. And with time zones and stuff, it wasn't easy. I think it ended up being evening for me, morning for her. And she was just the most faithful friend every week in and week out. And she had 2 young kids at the time, and she still made time for me to just check in with me, to listen, to let me share. Because a lot of what was going on for me at the time was I didn't understand why I had gotten to this place. Like, it's like, well, I know things are stressful, but I don't know why that leads me to not wanting to leave my apartment anymore. Like, how do I get from A to B? How did this happen? And she just let me process and process and process for months on end. And it was so kind and generous of her. And I will be forever grateful to her because she played an integral role in my healing, in my just sort of self-understanding. And I think it's grown my own understanding of the power of just sitting with somebody in their sorrow, in their pain. She had a lot of wisdom to offer. which I deeply appreciated. And at the same time, the times when she wasn't offering wisdom were just as valuable to me, when she was just listening and showing me that she understood and she cared, and that my experience was valid and important. And so that's the kind of friend that I hope to be to others. I feel like I'm still working toward that. But that's why I love the gift of empathy that people bring to the world. I love the work that you're doing because it's just so important. And I think that empathy, the more that we can express it to one another and share it with one another, the more healing will happen for all of us, and will bring all of our communities to a better place.
Hallelujah to that.
Yeah.
What a sweet way to end this conversation. I'm touched by your story. I hope when this episode comes out, you'll send it to your friend. And I love the question, because each and every time it centers me again on the simplicity of kindness, and the simplicity of generosity, and the simplicity of empathy. And it's available to us all if we just turn the volume up. So why don't we just do it, right?
Yeah. Definitely.
Dorcas, thank you so much for writing this great book, and sharing this kinship that we have with Broadleaf Books. And I want to thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a delight, and I appreciate your support and your encouragement, and really hope we can continue this conversation.
Same, and I love your earrings, I have to tell you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for watching and listening. We will see you next week at Purposeful Empathy. Thanks so much for watching this episode, and I hope you'll consider subscribing to the channel. Purposeful Empathy is devoted to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. You've just done something about it by watching the show. Again, subscribe if you can, and consider picking up a copy today.